In this video, I am going to be sending Kerbals higher, faster, and into more death than they have ever faced before. Hello everyone, Karnasa here, and welcome back to Kerbal Gets Real Redux. Aside from the aforementioned Kerbal death, we're also going to be attempting to achieve first orbit in 1954, and also flying some planes incredibly quickly. Mach 2 quickly. That's pretty fast. Slight disclaimer, all mentions of Kerbal death may be highly exaggerated, although that being said, there were definitely quite a few near misses. But before any of that's to come, once again, we're back at the Space Center. I swear, I spend all of my time at the Space Center. Initially, just a quick warp ahead to get mission control finished. As mentioned in the last episode, probably a mistake, but at least it's finished now, and I'll get a bit more funding a day. Next up is making sure George Edwards is completely trained in the new mission parameters for the X-1. With the unlock of the next supersonic flight tech node, I'm now able to push that cockpit to 75 kilometers, and you can be sure I'm absolutely going to do that. Not only will it complete a few milestone contracts, it will also hopefully push George's retirement date back just a little bit. And hey, every little helps. With the training underway, I got to messing around with staffing. Seriously exciting business, all this hiring and firing people. I shuffle around my engineers to try and make them as efficient as possible. But really, the important thing that happens here is my researchers, because now I have 420. I swear it's just a coincidence I didn't really try to get the funny number. Please believe me. Joking aside, having that many researchers is really starting to push my tech forward, allowing me to unlock orbital rocketry way ahead of time. But now with George all trained up, a quick trip into mission control to pick up the first high altitude X-plane contract, one of the contracts that is needed to be completed to complete the program, before mounting the plane onto an even bigger plane and then air launching it for the first launch of this episode. Hopefully George doesn't have anything too nice planned for Valentine's Day, because the day before, the 13th of February, she is strapped once again into an X-1 cockpit, this time with the aims of going higher than ever before. I know episode 2 was getting high on rocket fuel, but well, we now have the technology to go much higher. And for those of you that did watch episode 2, this plane may look very familiar. In fact, it's nigh on identical, although it has been improved in a number of different ways. Well, I say a number of different ways, it's got 2 engines strapped onto the back rather than 1. But those engines are much better and much more capable than they were before. They are the upgraded variant of the XLR-11, the second upgrade. I cannot remember what that is off of the top of my head, so you'll have to look that up if you really want to know. And because of that, well, there is one crucial thing that is really important. They do not need high pressure tanks. That is huge. That is such a mass reduction that it gives me loads more Delta V. I've got Delta V coming out of my ears in this plane. Well, not really, it's not able to get to orbit, but it can get much higher than it ever did. That coupled with the fact that the cockpit can now be pressurized up to 75 kilometers, well, yeah, we're gonna go a lot higher than we have ever done before. Now, the contract that I picked up for this, the high altitude one, does require me to only go over 40 kilometers, but I'm going to push this a lot further. And the reason for this is I've got high altitude science on this thing. So the longer I spend over 40 kilometers, the more of that science I get. And as I said earlier in this episode, I have 420 researchers now. They are researching things very quickly, and I am at risk of running out of technologies to do. And that would be a real shame, because then I would have loads of people sitting on their hands doing absolutely nothing. Aside from that, there is also the added bonus that every 10 kilometers I go in altitude completes another milestone contract, and that's only going to give me a bit more reputation, which I have already maxed out my subsidy at the moment, but still, having a bit of a buffer is certainly going to be nice. Another slight modification to this plane is I have added RCS ports. Going above 40 kilometers means those tiny little wings aren't really going to give me much control at all. The atmosphere, well, it's pretty non-existent up there, so I need some way of being able to control this on its descent, because if I'm unable to, well, things would go very badly for George indeed, and I would like to keep her around for another couple of years yet. The plane does break many altitude records though, even going higher than 70 kilometers. If I really wanted to, I probably could push this above the Kármán line, but I'm not going to, because once again that would spell death, and I would rather not bring death upon George. She is my only pilot after all, and that would be quite a costly mistake. But anyway, speaking of death, we are now coming in for for our landing, and this is always a worrying time, especially for an inexperienced, rather rubbish, completely useless pilot such as myself. But thankfully, I'm not piloting this vessel, George is. Well, I mean, I am piloting the vessel, but in my mind, George is the one who's at the controls. Okay, don't look at me. I'm sure she'll do just fine. Once again, I tested this numerous times in the spaceplane hangar using simulations in order to pick the perfect launch distance for this, and because of that, I come down exactly over the cape. On the final approach, the left wing does get a little bit hot. Definitely something to consider with future iterations of high altitude X-planes. Yes, I really should upgrade from early wings to supersonic ones, but it's not a problem, at least for this flight. And only a few short terrifying minutes later, I'm able to bring the plane down on the shuttle runway. Going just a slightly speedy 160 meters per second when I land, it really isn't the best of landings, but at least I am able to bring the plane to a complete stop. Once again, flaps or spoilers would be really useful here, but don't worry, by the end of the episode, there will be a plane that has at least spoilers, but no flaps yet. That will come next episode, I promise. The planes do keep getting better. That flight with high altitude experiments on board did push me above 10 science, and that meant I could pick up satellite era science. This is something that is needed to complete the first satellite program, so definitely a tech worth picking up. Avionics prototypes is the next tech unlocked though, and with this, it's time to enter the vehicle assembly building to build the first orbital rocket, minus the 2 solid rocket boosters that will actually get it to orbit. Yeah, 56 to 57 solid rockets I don't quite have unlocked yet, but in order to get around this, I had 2 versions of this craft designed, one with the GCRCs and one without. I'm going to build the one without, and when the tech gets unlocked, I'm going to edit that craft and then add them in. I'm hoping with such a minor addition, it doesn't add an awful lot to my build time, but this way I can start working on the rocket before the tech is even unlocked. This may be a little bit cheesy, but I feel once you start researching something, that's when development starts and that's when testing starts. And so my space program, having already picked up this tech, knows that that's coming, and they can build a launch vehicle around that, knowing that in the future, they'll be able to mount the solid rockets after a little bit more R&D work. And hopefully this will shave a little bit of time off to reaching first orbit. Whilst in the VAB, I also purchased the toolings for the rocket, which weren't hugely expensive, considering I am still using the base Thunderbolt for this, and all diameter sizes that I have used previously. Well, except for the second stage, but we'll get to that once we launch it. With the rocket now being built, for the first time in I think 2 episodes, it's time to put more money into my engineers. I want to build this as fast as possible. In the original Kerbal Gets Real, I got to orbit on the 16th of August 1954. I would really like to beat that, and with the Thunderbolt complex fully staffed, that is looking pretty promising, as currently the rocket is going to be finished on the 18th of July. Obviously there are rollout times to consider, and I also need to add the solid rockets. All I'm going to say for now is it's going to be very close. In the meantime though, all I can do is put George into a precarious situation and make her fly yet another one of my creations. Well, at least the last time she flew this, everything went fine, and I'm sure history will repeat itself. Nothing possibly could go wrong. But yes, this flight of the XH-5A is exactly the same as the last one. Really thrilling content I'm putting out here. No edits have been made to the plane at all. Right now, I'm just farming those optional high-altitude contracts for the confidence gain. Oh, and also, I can't complete the high-altitude science in one go. And that's partly because you can only complete a certain amount of the experiment at once. And also, yeah, I can't stay above 40 kilometers for more than a couple of minutes at a time with this design, and realistically with the tech I have at the moment, well, I'm not going to be able to do that. Clearly a better X-plane is going to be needed, and well, I do come up with a design later on in this series, the ASP, that will perform much better. The flight goes completely according to plan though, and I gain a little bit more altitude this time, and by a little bit I mean a little bit. Seriously, 100 meters more than the last flight. I really don't want to be putting George in any danger of suffocation, because that would lead to death. With the altitude hit and more science gained, it was time to bring this back down. This time I was a little too fast approaching the shuttle runway. I really don't want to be landing this at more than 200 meters per second. So I did a flyover and was going to attempt to land at the Kerbal Space Center runway, except I was still going too fast. So I aborted that as well and ended up going back for the shuttle runway, this time coming down at only 105 meters per second. A lot more manageable speed to be landing at. Still, maybe some drag parachutes would be required, or, you know, flaps to actually control my descent a little bit better. I mentioned the ASP, that one does have flaps, and that plane was a lot easier to land. With the flight, more high altitude science was gained, and George's retirement date gets pushed back another 45 days, which is always nice. Unfortunately though, I don't have enough science to pick up any new tech yet, so I quickly went into the VAB building to build another sounding rocket. There was a reasonable amount of space-low biological science that I have not yet picked up, so what better way to get that than completely overbuild a blue sky and launch it for no monetary gain, but the science will be worth it. Still keen to get techs unlocked as fast as possible, I pick up another 20 researchers, bringing my total up now to 450. Then the rest of my money is spent on engineers to staff the blue sky complex, as I had no engineers left over. They're all working on the orbital Thunderbolt. And speaking of, 56 to 57 solid rockets were unlocked, which meant that I could go into the VAB, add the GCRCs, and finally build an orbital capable rocket. It did take 10% off the build progress, which is another 20 days required to build it, but still the rocket will be finished on the 7th of August, so a little ways before my record time. I just hope that the rollout time isn't ridiculous. I'm not entirely sure what happened to Blue Sky 5. We don't talk about Blue Sky 5, but here's Blue Sky 6. I even went back and checked my old footage. I never launched a Blue Sky 5. I went straight from 4 to 6. I think it may have been a design that never actually made it to flight. Anyway, this design is the most upgraded sounding rocket I could possibly want. I've got the best tanks that I can use, I've got the best UR1250 variant, and I've got a big Nike solid rocket booster at the very bottom, which will propel this quite far. As is always the case with these early sounding rockets though, I light the solid rocket and the main engine at the same time on the launch pad. One of the failure options that I have with test flight is high dynamic pressure failures being enabled. If I were to try and activate the second stage engine in mid-flight, well, that's not going to go well. There will be something like a 95% reduction in reliability, so it's best just to light them all on the launch pad. This rocket does exactly what it's supposed to though. It gets very high, almost to 400 kilometers in altitude, and that is perfect for gaining all of the remaining science that I could possibly want from space low. Well, the biological science anyway. I do actually miss out on maybe half a science point, but really, I'm not sure if I can be bothered getting that. It's not worth my time anymore. The cost of building one of these isn't really that expensive, but I have my own sanity to deal with. Flying repeated sounding rocket launches, we're at the end of that. The grind is over. This will be the last one. I wasn't even planning on flying another sounding rocket. I picked up the orbital program, but I thought, well, there is science to be gained, and I did gain 10 science from this flight, which is a reasonable amount in the early game. But anyway, the top of the sounding rocket is decoupled, the parachute is activated, and the rocket comes safely back down to the surface of the Earth, using a parachute on the bottom. I would have been very upset if I'd have forgotten to place a parachute on this, I won't lie. With the massive 10 science gained from that flight, okay, it's not a huge amount, but it's something. I go into R&D and pick up early avionics and probes and lunar range communications. Now, I don't have a program to go to the moon yet, but I am fairly certain with a 1-ton capable launch vehicle, which is something I will need to build for my first satellite program, I should be more than fine doing lunar flybys and orbiters. And yeah, in order to communicate with those at the moon, I do need to pick up that tech. From this point on, the Blue Sky Launch Complex is going to be completely useless, so I decide to dismantle it. I don't know if that's a good idea, but it will save me a little bit of funding, because to be honest, I'm never going to be launching a small tiny sounding rocket again. What I will be launching though is the X5HA yet again, for the 3rd time in this episode, and there are still more plane flights to come. And yeah, a first attempt at getting to orbit, that's also coming. This flight though is now on the 8th of May, and really the only thing that's stopping me from launching these constantly is the recovery and air launch time of the plane. The training for this takes no time whatsoever, so I could keep flying these over and over and over again if I wanted to, but I'm not going to. This is going to be the last time, and that's because once I complete this additional optional contract, which is to get to 70 kilometers, then I can't take this any higher. If I pick up any more, it's going to be above the ceiling that this plane can operate, and I will kill George. In order to go above 75 kilometers, I need to research hypersonic flight, which gives me the X-15 cockpit. That's something that I have not picked up yet, because it does cost 12 science to get, and I didn't think I really needed it immediately. There were better things to unlock first. The plane hits 70 kilometers just fine though, as it has done twice already this episode. And now it's just a simple case of bringing George back safely in one piece. And as we've seen this flight twice already, I won't keep you waiting. I am able to successfully bring the plane back down on the runway, and the flight is a complete success. I haven't mentioned it, but landing on the runway every time I complete one of these contracts actually gains me a lot more confidence than if I were to just ditch it anywhere. Yeah, landing in a field outside Florida Man's house unfortunately does not get you as much cash as landing on the nicely built runway. It's also safer. The terrain around the Cape can be quite unforgiving. Obviously, this doesn't always happen, especially if you miscalculate where your plane should be starting, or if you have an engine failure on a rocket plane like this. Two things that definitely won't happen in a future episode, right? Anyway, that's to come later. And now, for a series where I said I wasn't going to be showcasing much going on in the spaceplane hangar or the VAB, we're back in the spaceplane hangar. I was reviewing my footage and found that I'd built this plane very quickly and thought, yeah, let's throw it in its extra content. Now being just a few months away from unlocking mature supersonic flight, I thought it was time to work on a Mach 2 capable jet plane, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing right now. And this was the first time in this series that I put a lot of thought and care and attention and passion into a plane that I designed. And by that I mean I didn't just stick elevons on the end of the wings. No, I actually shaped the wings to have a bit more structure and tried to make it look a little bit better than anything that I had designed before. Now this design philosophy I do take going forward, and I actually improve upon it for future iterations of planes in this series. I figure out ways of making the wings look a little bit better than I have designed here, because at the moment they look a little bit weird. I didn't taper off the edges and it does look like a little bit of an eyesore, but I figure out a way in the future to make that look a lot better. Anyway, the engine that I'm going to be going for this Mach 2 supersonic plane is going to be the J75. It is a behemoth of an engine, and with all of the air intakes that I'm going to plop on this plane, well, it's more than capable of going Mach 2. I did test this an awful lot in simulations, and I am fairly confident that it can reach those speeds. Now, with the intakes for this design, I decided rather than having a sharp nose cone and slapping intakes on the sides of the main fuselage, I'd go for more of the electric lightning look and have an intake on the nose. Hey, I'm quite used to building lightnings by now. However, I've gone for horizontal engines rather than vertical, because as mentioned before, I don't want to be copying any real life designs in this series. Anyway, that's the plane pretty much all done. Next up, I thought it was really about time that I build the larger launch pad that is going to be able to take 1 ton to low Earth orbit. And yes, I came up with this design, the Odyssey. This isn't its final form, no, it does go through a few different design changes. Most notably, right now it's using balloon tanks, which I swap out for Isogrid, because balloon tanks were quite frankly too expensive to 1, purchase, and 2, tool. Yeah, the total unlock cost of this was almost 400,000 funds. Now, I can take money from my research credits, but I'm not going to have that kind of money for a long time. This would have just been frankly way too expensive to build. I'll talk more about this rocket when we first get to launching it though. It's gonna take a while because the launch pad isn't even going to be complete for another 200 days. That's why I wanted to start getting it built. Back at the Space Center though, and there is one more final flight that I want to do in a plane before we attempt to make first orbit in 1954. Yeah, it's the return of the, oh my god, what is that thing and why does it even fly? Or in other words, the XPT-002 Supersonic that was completely bugged out in the last episode. And I think this really was when I personally noticed it whilst flying it. Like, I mean, I did notice it a little bit in the last episode, but when flying it, this was the most egregious. Especially on takeoff, as soon as I lifted the landing gear. Now, I know in the last episode, a lot of people did say it's probably because the landing gear are actually attached to the engines rather than the tank, which I thought that they were attached on, and that is pushing the tank through the engines, because the engines on this plane pretty much covered that entire tank. They are very, very, very big. So at least that's probably solved the reason why that bug happened. But still, it does look rather silly, and it's always fun breaking aerodynamics, because this plane can go pretty quick, even with all of that janky stuff going on. And the only reason I'm flying this again is because I still have a bit of supersonic science left in the X1 cockpit to grab, and not really wanting to miss out on any science that's pretty easy to get, considering I've already designed this plane and I know that it works. Well, I'm gonna fly it very briefly and pick up the last of that science. But considering how cursed this plane was, and bearing in mind we saw it fly twice in the last episode, I'm gonna breeze through this, and yeah, this will basically be all that you see of this flight until the landing. So the landing didn't quite go as well as I would have liked. Nothing broke though, but because I got rid of the HUD to try and get a beauty shot of the plane coming down, well, yeah, I ran off the edge of the runway like a complete fool. This is what you get when you try and get some fancy shots and you end up almost killing your pilots, but luckily no one was harmed in the making of this Kerbal Gets Real Redux episode. An additional 2.5 science isn't really anything to write home about, but at least it's something. And now finally we are on approach for first orbit. Yes, that is going to be the next mission that we launch. Thunderbolt XPT-X is finished on the 7th of August, and I hover over the rollout button thinking, am I going to beat my record if we roll this out in time? And the answer is no, unfortunately not. I'm going to be 2 days later than I was in the original Kerbal Gets Real. Seriously, 2 days in it. Now, if this does make it to orbit, I would be pretty happy with that achievement, considering this is now programs and launch complexes, and they have made it so much harder to try and beat historical dates. It has become infinitely more difficult to keep up with history, at least in my experience from playing through this save, and having read other people's opinions on programs and launch complexes. So to get quite close within my original date, if it succeeds, I was not too bothered by this. So on the 18th of August 1954, yes, 2 days later, Redshift I, a small probe on top of a Thunderbolt XPT launch vehicle, is ready to be launched. Now, this probe is not named after the physical phenomenon, but actually something a little bit different. But I'll go more into the naming conventions of the probes and satellites in this series in a little bit. First, I want to be talking about the launch vehicle itself, because it is very much a caveman design. On the first stage, an RD-101, not even a 102 or 103, no, the second version of the RD-100 series you unlock. I have only just researched basic rocketry, so I think I can upgrade it, but I didn't need to. I had the Delta V in this design without needing to do that, and it's only one engine, so there's a lot less chance of failure than clustering engines. I was actually really quite pleased with this design, because it does only weigh 23 tons on the launch pad, and is able to get a small probe up to orbit, and potentially even get a probe up to a polar orbit as well, which is something that I definitely will be trying to achieve in the near future. So that's the first stage engine. The tanks have been upgraded to aluminium stringer tanks, which is currently the best conventional tanks that I can use. I don't have isogrid or balloon tanks unlocked yet because I haven't researched that technology. Like I said, this is going to be a very caveman design. The best thing about the first stage though is it is just a Thunderbolt. It is what I have been flying the past 3 episodes, just made a little bit more powerful and a little bit more mass friendly by upgrading the tanks. And now onto the second stage, and where the XPT in Thunderbolt XPT comes from. So you may have noticed all of my X-Planes in this series have been XPTs, which stands for unimaginatively X-Plane Test. Yeah, I really didn't do very well with the naming conventions of those planes. And so this second stage is called the XPT stage because it uses the same engine that my X-Planes have been using. The XLR-11, or more specifically in this case the XLR-35RM1, which is slightly worse than the standard XLR-11 in that it only has one ignition, but it can be airlit, and it does also have gimbal. I have placed RCS on the side of this stage to provide a little bit more control if I need it, but the fact that it can gimbal does mean that I really shouldn't need to have that RCS on at all, and probably was a little bit of extra mass that I could have done away with. But this stage is pretty light, especially using fully upgraded conventional tanks, so the first stage was more than capable of lifting this and also having quite a reasonable amount of Delta V itself. And then finally the final 2 stages, which is just 2 GCRCs after one another. They pack an awful lot of punch for not very much mass, which makes them perfect for placing them on top of a small design like this. And altogether on the launch pad, it gets me about 9,750 meters per second of Delta V, which is more than enough to get to orbit. And once again, it's just a 23-ton launch vehicle using pretty basic tech. Yeah, I am very proud of this design, and if you want to steal it, it is on my Patreon, which there will be a link in the description. In order to fly this, I did have to use Smart ASS from MechJeb. I can't use MechJeb Autopilot because it's got an unguided couple of stages at the top. MechJeb Ascent Guidance doesn't really like those. I personally really like MechJeb Ascent Guidance, and I will be using it as soon as I have got rockets that don't have unguided stages. That way I can get slightly better cinematic shots and hide the UI a little bit more. For this, I had to have the UI up at all times because I needed to fly it, and I needed to see exactly what I was doing. I could have gone back and filmed some more, but I didn't really have the time, unfortunately, at least this time round. But anyway, with the final GCRC activated and burning to complete completion, the probe Redshift I makes it to orbit, and it is a dinky little probe. I don't even have a decoupler between the GCRC and the Science Core avionics. I've used Science Core because they do not weigh a lot, and you can make them very small, even at this stage of the game. The probe has barely enough battery on it for a few days, and it only has one experiment on board, which is the mass spectrometer. That's the only experiment that I have available at the moment that I have not completed in low space, so it made sense to forego any other experiments and just whack that one on. Now, I called this Redshift, and I only decided to name it Redshift whilst I was recording this voiceover because it was just the Thunderbolt XPT-1 when I was building it in-game, and I did mention it wasn't due to the physical phenomena. No, it kind of is. What I have taken it off of was based upon that. So my naming convention in this series is I have a favourite band, and I am basically going to be using songs, titles, words from in songs that are going to name my rockets. And that band is called Enter Shikari, and they have a song called Redshift, and it's a very nice song, and that's why this was called Redshift. But later on, I'm going to have the Spark series of probes, which are going to go to the moon. There's going to be Shackleton, which is taken from a lyric from a song called Arguing with Thermometers, and you know, Shackleton being an explorer, I felt like my interplanetary probes would do well from being called that too. And yeah, so that's the naming convention I've gone for. In the last Kerbal Gets Real, I think I went with Greek or Roman gods. I know it was mythology, but this time around I wasn't really sure, and I felt, well, Spotify Wrapped came out and I saw that I'd listened to them quite a lot, and I thought, you know what? Yeah, my designs can be named after you. Anyway, with absolutely no failures whatsoever, Redshift I makes it to orbit and completes the first orbit contract, which, as you may be able to tell, I was quite excited about. And of course, returning to the Space Center, we are greeted with a fantastic newspaper article. Artificial satellite orbits Earth. We have done it. We have made it to space and stayed in 1954. In August 1954, 3 years ahead of a historical date. Not bad going. But now I need to wait for my very heavy launch vehicle in order to complete the next few contracts. So what better to do to come into research and development and pick up hypersonic flight? That tech node that I did mention earlier that I'm going to need in order to complete the X-Plane program. With that tech complete and giving George almost an hour's worth of training to fly the new X-Plane prototype, I'm sure that won't lead to bite me. It's time to fly the Mach 2 capable supersonic plane that we designed earlier on in this episode. So there have just been 3 months without a launch, and on the 15th of November we fly the XPT-001 HSSS, or the X-Plane Test 1 High-Speed Supersonic. Really, the numbering conventions of these planes are going a little bit weird, because we've had 5, we've had 4, now we've gone back down to 1. I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing with this, but it's more the letters on the end that really count, and I think the numbers were my iteration of that specific plane. Anyway, from taking off on the landway, you may have noticed that the plane wobbled quite a bit because the wheels are very close together. It's almost like riding a bike down a jet runway. Yes, I probably could have moved those wheels further apart and not really run into any problems. This will definitely not be something that I have an issue with later on in this flight. I did pick up the Mach 2 supersonic contract before going out on this flight, and upon reaching level flight at about 10,500 meters in altitude, we are more than capable of absolutely smashing that speed. In fact, I could go much faster if I wanted to. I had to slow this down in order to not go above 650 meters per second, which is something that the contract requires. It's quite a tight margin, 625 to 650, but luckily I am using atmospheric autopilot, which is more than capable of holding my altitude as well as my speed. Not only am I going to be completing this contract, which is one of the required ones for the X-Plane program, I also have Mach 2 supersonic flight experimentation on this plane, which is another whole 15 science points worth of research that I can get. Once again, this is going to be needed to be done over the course of several flights, so I won't get it all in one flight, so do expect to see lots of repeat flights of this plane. Designing X-Planes is fun and all, but I do understand why a lot of people do skip them, because there is a lot of repeated flights. You fly the same thing over and over again just to get a little bit more science, but that science is going to be critically important for me if I want to speed through anything. If I don't do this, then I will be missing out on like nearly 60 science from all of the different experiments that you can put on these planes, which in the early game is a huge amount. It also, as mentioned in the first episode, gets me more money, and that is also going to be required to speed things through. If I wouldn't have picked this up, I probably wouldn't have been able to make first orbit in 1954. Anyway, after 8 minutes of flying, the science on this plane is completely depleted, and it's time to send it back to the Space Center to try and land. I really did completely overbuild the fuel tanks on this craft, still having almost half of my fuel left by the time that I wanted to return. So in reality, I could probably make this go faster faster if I made the plane a little bit lighter. But it's always nice to have a little bit of extra fuel, so you're not going to end up coming down in a lake in Florida somewhere and get eaten by a rather angry alligator. I feel like it would be a much more fitting end for George to go out in a blaze of glory, crashing a space capsule, than being snacked on by Mr. Chomp. Anyway, perfectly lined up with the shuttle runway for final descent, I was still going quite fast, and this is a plane that does not have spoilers yet. That will come in the next iteration. Coming down at about 150 seconds with those bicycle wings was not ideal. Now luckily, before I started this flight, I action grouped the eject button, and as soon as the plane started tipping at 140 meters per second, I hit that. I did not want to be killing George. I never tested landing while simulating this, which is why I went and action grouped the eject button. I am fairly sure if I wouldn't have ejected there, George would have died, and I would have been very sad. Not only would I have been very sad with that, I'm quite sad at the moment anyway, because now I have to rebuild that plane. It got completely torn apart. None of it survived, but that does mean I can go back and make some crucial refits that are going to make landing this plane a lot better, including the aforementioned spoilers. Still no flaps though, because the plane is a delta wing design. I don't really have the option of using flaps on this. I'm not sure, because there's no pitch control at the back. The only pitch control I have is on the main wing, which is really not a great way of flying a plane, but I learned from my mistakes and I will make better planes later on. And yeah, the plane also does only have one control surface for both roll and pitch. Really not the best of designs I've come up with here, but trust me, they do get better. Next episode, that's when they really start getting good. I swear. Come back next episode. I promise you'll see a plane that flies well. Really, if I'm flying all of these planes, why am I not just playing Flyout? I do have that game, and I have touched it a little bit. It might be fun to get into that a little bit more. Anyway, the next iteration of the plane was designed and ready to be flown on the 28th of December. There is another Thunderbolt XPT being built as well. Unfortunately, that won't be finished until the 2nd of January, so it will be coming early next year, but not quite at the end of this one. Really cutting it close to the end of this year, the second flight of the X1 HSSS is performed on the 28th of December, 3 days until the end of the year. Every single episode of this series so far, I swear I have flown something in December, and that was a bit of a meme with the old Kerbal Gets Real series. You don't fly in December because if you fly in December, Test Flight comes along and says, ha, you shouldn't be flying in this month, and breaks all of my rockets. But I've been quite fortunate with the month this time. There have, however, been years where everything has gone wrong over in this new series, which we will get to, but yes, there is one year in particular that I remember with great disdain, and I am I'm not looking forward to trying to edit that video. Now, one problem that I had with the last flight is I was able to complete the contract parameters for the Mach 2 supersonic flight. However, because the plane crashed upon landing, I didn't fulfill one part of the contract, which was to return home safely. The cockpit exploded, which meant that the part that needed to return home safely was broken, and that wasn't completed. I was able to get to Mach 2 supersonic flight with this again, and I was able to perform more science with this plane. However, when I touch down later on, I do not complete the contract, and that's because I think it was tied with the old plane. I did, however, manage to complete all contract parameters, so later on, when you see me go into the cheat menu to complete the contract, that is why. I don't do that normally, but this is something that I have always done in RO and RP1, and something that I've even seen the devs recommend, because sometimes contracts can be a little bit buggy, and when you feel like a contract should be completed, but it's not, well, then just go in and cheat complete it, because yeah, buggy contracts are a thing. This plane is perfectly capable though, and with the wider landing gear, it also took off a lot better too, and yeah, pretty easily gets up to over 625 meters per second. In fact, this plane can push 700 meters per second, so it is very speedy. Not quite fast enough for hypersonic flight, although I'm not really sure if any jet plane is capable of doing hypersonic flight. I know in real life that was performed by the X-15, and something I will be doing in a couple of years' time once I have unlocked the technology for that, but the flight all in is completely successful, and I'm able to land this on the runway much nicer than before. It doesn't wobble all over the place because I managed to bleed off quite a lot more speed before landing this time round thanks to the spoilers placed on top of the wings, and because the landing gear are a lot wider, there's more of a base touching the ground, and it prevents bicycle plane syndrome, where the plane will start rolling left and right and eventually lead to its demise, as we saw with the last flight. As mentioned, I did have to cheat complete the contract, but the flight was a complete success. And now, once again, we are at the end of the year, and an awful lot has happened over this year. We got to first orbit, we broke Mach 2, and we sent Kerbals higher than they have ever been, almost to 75 kilometers. Now, these episodes have progressively been getting longer and longer, and that's because I'm changing the way I edit these a little bit. Usually what I do is I watch back the footage and talk over it, but this time, instead of doing that, I am watching the footage, remembering what happened, then talking about what comes to the top of my head about that footage and then editing the footage around the words that I have said. It's a little bit different, but it is making the videos run on a little longer than I usually would like. Usually my videos are between 15 and 20 minutes. The last one was 30 minutes, and because I'm still recording this voiceover now, I've got no idea how long this one's going to be, but I feel like it's definitely going to be pushing about 32 minutes. I wonder if I'm correct. We'll have to see once I edit this. I'm going to leave that bit in because I want to know just how close my approximation was. But they are taking me quite a long time to do, and I know I've got a schedule for every Sunday, but I am going to say, not next weekend, but the weekend after, which is the 24th of December, I am not going to be releasing one. Sunday the 24th, Christmas Eve, there will not be a Kerbal Gets Real Redux episode coming out. I want to give myself a bit of time to try and bulk edit a few of these, and then that way I am not stressing out the night before or even the day of, which is what I am doing right now. I'm recording this at about 9 AM my time. The video is going to be coming out at 6 PM. So yeah, I don't really want to be getting into a habit where I am stressing out about the videos of the day that they're supposed to release. I want to bulk edit a few, so I don't really have to worry about that, because I really did not get the best of sleep last night, thinking I've got so much editing to do in the morning. I have been working on this a bit all week, but life always gets in the way. I will give a bit of an updated time frame for that next episode though, because it might even be the week after. And that's really mainly because it's Christmas and I'll be spending time with my family, and it's also my birthday, so I will selfishly be spending some time for myself. In the next episode though, we are going to be taking Kerbals very high on jet fuel. That's right, it's going to be time for the stratospheric X-plane contract, and of course we have more orbital missions to try and complete. Hopefully test flight won't rear its ugly head, but who knows. A big thanks to Y Mandarin, Darth Malachor, Moss Config, Mr. Blue Star, Ryan Miller, and the rest of my patrons and members for their continued support. I have been Karnasa, and I will see you later.